Sometimes the most unexpected friendships are born from the simplest acts of kindness. In a world where survival meant trusting no one cowboy was about to discover that compassion could change everything. In the harsh wilderness of the 1800s, frontier, a weathered cowboy sits alone by his campfire when a tiny wolf pup appears at the edge of the firelight. Starving and desperate, the little creature doesn't attack or flee. Instead, it simply sits and waits, its eyes filled with ancient wisdom. When the cowboy looks into those amber eyes, he sees something that stops him cold. This isn't just any wild animal begging for scraps. What he discovers next will forge a bond that legends are made of. But could you imagine risking everything for a creature the whole world tells you to fear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of sage and snow across the Wyoming territory, a reminder that winter held dominion over these vast stretches of wilderness, even in what passed for spring. Jack Sterling pulled his weathered coat tighter as he poked at the dying embers with a charred stick, watching sparks rise like tiny stars against the purple twilight. At 43, he had learned to read the language of the land. The way, clouds gathered over distant peaks, the subtle shift in bird calls that warned of approaching storms, the tracks that told stories of who had passed this way before him. His camp was nothing more than a ring of stones beside a creek that ran clear and cold from the mountains. No tent, just a bedroll and oilcloth tarp stretched between two sturdy pines. Jack had been living this way for the better part of 5 years now, moving from one cattle drive to another, following the seasons and the work. It was a good life, for a man who preferred the company of stars to that of most people he'd met. The firelight flickered across his weathered hands as he reached for his saddlebags, pulling out a worn leather journal bound with a simple thong. The cover was scarred and stained from years of use, the leather soft as chamois from countless evenings like this one. Inside, pressed between pages of careful script, were dried wildflowers, sketches of mountain vistas, and the occasional pressed leaf that had caught his eye during the day's ride. Jack opened to a fresh page and began sketching the view before him. The way the creek caught the last light, the silhouette of the mountains against the darkening sky. Drawing had been his solace since childhood, back when his mother had given him his first piece of charcoal and shown him how to capture the world on paper. She'd had an artist's eye, could see beauty in the most ordinary things, a trait she'd passed to her son, along with her quiet strength and unshakable moral compass. Those qualities had served him well during his years as a deputy sheriff in the town of Cedar Falls, 3 territories over. He'd worn the star with pride, believing deeply in the law and justice it represented, but that was before Red Morrison and his gang had ridden into town, before Jack had been forced to make choices that still haunted his sleep. The sound of water over stones filled the evening air, a gentle rhythm that usually brought him peace. Tonight, though, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, an awareness that prickled at the back of his neck like the feeling of being watched. Jack had learned to trust these instincts. They'd kept him alive through more than one dangerous situation. He set down his pencil and listened. The creek babbled on, oblivious to any threat. Night insects had begun their chorus, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. Nothing unusual, yet the feeling persisted. Jack had been riding the trail between Cheyenne and Laramie for 2 weeks now, carrying dispatches for the territorial government. It was honest work that paid decent wages, and it allowed him to avoid the larger towns where his past might catch up with him. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, finding in it a kind of peace he'd never known during his years behind a badge. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Jasper, stood hobbled nearby, ears pricked forward as he grazed on the sparse grass growing beside the creek. Jasper had been with Jack for 3 years now, a gift from a grateful rancher whose stolen cattle Jack had helped recover. The horse was intelligent and reliable, with a gentle disposition that made him excellent company on long trails. As Jack returned to his sketching, he found himself drawing not the landscape before him, but memories from his journals earlier. Pages. There was Sarah, his fiancée from Cedar Falls, her smile captured in careful pencil strokes. She'd had hair the color of wheat and eyes that sparkled with laughter. They'd planned to marry in the spring, to build a house on the hill overlooking the valley where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion. But that future had died along with Sarah when the Crimson Gang had taken the town hostage during a bank robbery gone wrong. Jack's hand tightened on the pencil as he remembered that terrible day. The sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, the way Sarah had looked at him with trust, even as Red Morrison held a gun to her head. She'd believed Jack would save her just as he'd saved others before, but this time his devotion to justice had cost him everything he held dear. The pencil snapped in his grip, the sharp crack echoing across the still air. Jack stared at the broken pieces, then carefully closed the journal and set it aside. Some memories were better left undisturbed, especially on nights when the wind carried voices from the past. He pulled out a small pot and filled it with creek water, setting it on a flat rock near the fire's edge to heat. Coffee would help settle his nerves, and he had a long day's ride ahead tomorrow. The dispatches in his saddlebags needed to reach Laramie by week's end, and the weather looked to turn nasty before then. As he waited for the water to boil, Jack found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this lonely campfire. After Sarah's death and his final confrontation with the Crimson Gang, he'd turned in his badge and ridden west, carrying nothing but his horse, his gun, and the weight of his failures. The frontier had welcomed him, as it welcomed all men seeking to escape their past, with indifference and the promise that survival depended on present actions, not previous mistakes. He'd found work easily enough. Cowboys were always needed, and Jack's experience with horses and his steady hand with a rifle made him valuable to any outfit. He'd ridden with cattle drives from Texas to Montana, worked as a scout for wagon trains, and even spent a winter hunting buffalo to feed railroad crews. Each job had been a step further from the man he'd been, until sometimes he wondered if Jack Sterling, the deputy sheriff who'd once believed in justice and happy endings, had ever really existed at all. The water began to bubble, and Jack spooned coffee grounds into the pot, watching the dark liquid swirl and change color. The familiar ritual was soothing, a small comfort in a life that had grown spare and practical. He'd learned to find satisfaction in simple things: a well-cooked meal, a warm fire, the sight of sunrise over empty country. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was honest and peaceful. And that was enough. A sound from the darkness beyond the firelight made him look up sharply. It wasn't the rustle of wind through branches or the scurry of some small rodent. This was different, deliberate and careful, the sound of something moving with purpose through the underbrush. Jack's hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip, thumb resting on the hammer. He'd learned long ago that the frontier held dangers, both human and animal, and preparation was the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming food for scavengers. The sound came again, closer this time, and Jack could see movement. In the shadows, just beyond the reach of the firelight, something small and dark, moving with the hesitant gait of an injured creature. His tension eased slightly. Whatever it was didn't seem large enough to pose a serious threat. Then it stepped into the light, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was a wolf pup, barely old enough to be away from its mother, with fur the color of storm clouds and eyes that reflected the firelight like amber jewels. The little creature was thin to the point of starvation, its ribs visible beneath its matted coat. One ear was torn, and there were scratches along its flank that spoke of a hard fight for survival. But what struck Jack most was the intelligence in those golden eyes. This wasn't the mindless desperation of a starving animal. There was awareness there, and something that looked almost like hope. The pup sat down just outside the ring of stones that marked Jack's camp, neither advancing nor retreating. It simply watched him with those remarkable eyes, waiting with a patience that seemed far too mature for such a young creature. Jack found himself remembering another night, years ago, when he'd been a boy on his family's farm in Ohio. A stray dog had appeared at their kitchen door during a winter storm, half frozen and starving. His mother had insisted they take the animal in, despite his father's protests about the expense of feeding another mouth. "Sometimes," she'd said as she wrapped the shivering dog in an old blanket, "kindness is the only thing standing between civilization and wilderness. We are who we choose to be in moments like this." The dog had become Jack's constant companion. For the next 10 years, loyal and brave and more intelligent than most people Jack had met since. When Old Blue had finally died, Jack had wept harder than he had for any human loss up to that point in his life. Now, looking into the wolf pup's eyes, he felt an echo of that same connection, the recognition that passed between kindred spirits. Regardless of species, this little creature had chosen to approach his fire rather than try to steal food or simply move on. It was asking for help in the only way it knew how. Jack reached slowly into his saddlebags and pulled out a strip of jerky, tearing off a small piece. The pup's ears perked forward, but it didn't move from its position outside the camp. Instead, it waited as Jack tossed the food halfway between them. The little wolf approached the jerky cautiously, sniffed it thoroughly, then swallowed it in one quick bite. It returned to its sitting position and continued to watch Jack with those incredible eyes, as if to say that one small piece of meat was appreciated but hardly sufficient for a creature so near starvation. Despite himself, Jack smiled. There was something undeniably appealing about the pup's straightforward approach to negotiation. No pretense, no deception, just honest need presented without shame or apology. "Well," Jack said quietly, his voice the first human sound to break. "The evening stillness. I suppose we should talk." The wolf pup tilted its head at the sound of Jack's voice, those amber eyes never leaving his face. There was something almost human in that gesture, a curiosity and intelligence that made Jack's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. He hadn't spoken to another living creature in weeks, and the simple act of conversation, even one-sided, felt like stepping back into a world he'd almost forgotten existed. "You're too young to be on your own," Jack continued, keeping his voice low and steady. "Where's your pack? Your mother?" The pup's ears drooped slightly, and Jack could have sworn he saw sadness flicker across those remarkable features. Whatever had separated this little one from its family hadn't been by choice. The wilderness was cruel to creatures alone, whether they walked on 2 legs or 4. Jack pulled out his silver pocket watch, a gift from his father on his 18th birthday. The inscription on the back read, "For Jack, may you always find your way home." The irony wasn't lost on him as he checked the time by firelight. Nearly 10 o'clock, and he'd planned to be asleep by now for an early start tomorrow. Instead, he found himself in a staring contest with a wolf pup that seemed in no hurry to leave. "I can't keep you," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "You're wild. You belong out there, not following some broken-down cowboy around the territory." The pup stood and took a tentative step closer, still maintaining that careful distance, but clearly expressing interest in further negotiation. Jack sighed and pulled out another piece of jerky, this one larger than the first. Instead of tossing it, he held it out in his palm, curious to see what the little creature would do. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with infinite care, the pup crept forward until it was close enough to delicately take the food from Jack's hand. Its teeth never touched his skin, and Jack could feel the incredible gentleness with which it accepted the offering. This was no mindless scavenger. This was a thinking, feeling creature making a conscious choice to trust. "You're smarter than you have any right to be," Jack murmured, watching as the pup retreated a few steps to eat. "And that's going to get us both in trouble." As if in response to his words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from somewhere in the darkness beyond the creek. Jack's hand went to his gun automatically, his body tensing as he strained to hear more. The pup's ears swiveled toward the sound, and Jack noticed how its entire posture changed. Alert, wary, ready to flee at the first sign of real danger. Hoofbeats faded, moving away toward the south, but their presence left Jack deeply unsettled. Travelers usually made camp before dark, especially in country this rough. Anyone riding at night was either running from something or toward something, and either possibility meant potential trouble. Jack stood and moved to where Jasper was picketed, running a reassuring hand along the horse's neck while scanning the surrounding darkness. The bay's ears were pricked forward, tracking sounds Jack couldn't hear, but the horse didn't seem alarmed. That was something, at least. Jasper had proven himself an excellent judge of danger over their years together. When Jack returned to the fire, the wolf pup was still there, watching him with what could only be described as concern. It was an expression so human-like that Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This little creature was reading his emotions, responding to his tension with empathy that belonged more to a loyal dog than a wild wolf. "You felt it too, didn't you?" Jack asked softly. "Something's not right out there." He fed the fire with deadwood he'd gathered earlier, building it up enough to last through the night. The larger blaze would be visible from a greater distance, but it would also discourage any predators from approaching camp. And if trouble was indeed coming, Jack wanted to see it before it saw him. The pup had crept closer during his fire tending, now sitting just inside the ring of stones that marked the camp's boundary. It was a significant gesture, Jack realized, crossing from the wilderness into his small circle of civilization. The little wolf was making a choice, declaring its intention to stay despite the obvious risks. "I'll make you a deal," Jack said, settling back down beside the fire. "You can stay the night, but come morning, you go your own way. I'm not a shepherd, and you're not a sheep. We both know how this has to end." But even as he spoke the words, Jack was already planning how to modify his travel schedule to accommodate a young wolf's shorter legs and greater need for rest. He pulled out a small tin of medical salve from his saddlebags and set it beside his bedroll. The pup's injuries needed attention, and Jack had learned enough frontier medicine to treat minor wounds in both animals and humans. The silver watch gleamed in the firelight as Jack wound it carefully, a nightly ritual that connected him to more settled times. He'd started timing the feedings of injured animals years ago during his deputy days, when the town veterinarian had taught him that regular small meals were better than large, infrequent ones for creatures recovering from trauma. "Every 4 hours, he told the pup, showing it the watch face as if it could understand. "That's how often you'll need to eat for the next few days. Your stomach's probably shrunk from not having regular food." The pup cocked its head again, studying the watch with the same intense focus it had given Jack's face. There was something uncanny about its attention span, the way it seemed to absorb and process information like a much older, more experienced animal. Jack made a small bed of pine boughs near the fire, close enough for warmth, but far enough away that the pup could retreat if it felt threatened. To his surprise, the little creature approached the makeshift nest without hesitation, circling it once before settling down with a contented sigh. "Scout," Jack said suddenly, the name coming from somewhere deep in his memory. "That's what I'll call you. You've got the eyes of a scout, always watching, always learning." The newly named scout lifted his head at the sound, ears perked with interest. When Jack repeated the name, the pup's tail gave a tentative wag, the first truly joyful expression Jack had seen from the little creature. As the night deepened, Jack found himself keeping watch not just for human threats, but for the wolf pack that might come looking for their missing member. He'd heard them howling in the distance over the past few nights, their voices carrying across the vast wilderness in haunting harmonies that spoke of family bonds and territorial warnings. But Scout seemed unconcerned about rejoining his own kind. Instead, He slept peacefully by the fire, occasionally opening one golden eye to check that Jack was still there before drifting off again. It was the sleep of a creature that felt safe. For the first time in days, maybe weeks. Jack tried to rest, but his mind kept circling back to those hoofbeats in the darkness. Something about their rhythm had seemed familiar, though he couldn't place exactly what had triggered his unease. Years of law enforcement had taught him to trust his instincts about danger, and right now those instincts were screaming warnings he couldn't quite decipher. He checked his pocket watch again. Midnight, time for Scout's second feeding of the night. The pup woke instantly at Jack's movement, alert and ready despite having been deep in sleep moments before. Another sign of an intelligence that went far beyond normal animal awareness. "Here you go, partner," Jack whispered, offering. "Another small piece of jerky. We'll get some real food in you tomorrow." As Scout accepted the meal, Jack made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of planning to send the pup away at dawn, he found himself calculating travel times to the nearest trading post where he could buy proper supplies. For caring for a young wolf, food, medicine, maybe even a collar to help others understand that Scout was under human protection. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was already thinking of Scout as his responsibility, his companion. After 5 years of deliberate solitude, of carefully avoiding emotional attachments that could lead to the kind of pain he'd experienced in Cedar Falls, he was preparing to risk his heart again on a creature that might abandon him at any moment. But as he looked into Scout's trusting amber eyes, Jack knew it was already too late for second thoughts. This little wolf had chosen him just as surely as he was choosing Scout. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The sound of hoofbeats returned in the early hours before dawn, closer this time and more persistent. Jack lay still in his bedroll, hand on his gun, listening as riders passed within 100 yards of his camp. 3 horses, moving at a steady pace toward the north. Professional riders, comfortable traveling in darkness. Scout was awake too, every muscle tense as he tracked the sounds. But the little wolf didn't growl or show any sign of wanting to investigate. Instead, he pressed closer to Jack's side, seeking protection rather than offering challenge. When the hoofbeats finally faded, Jack sat up and checked his watch again. 4:30 in the morning, time for Scout's next feeding, and the beginning of what promised to be a very different kind of day than any he'd experienced in recent years. "Looks like we're both going to learn what it means to trust again," he whispered to Scout as he prepared the pup's food. "I just hope we live long enough to figure out if it was worth the risk." Dawn broke grey and cold across the Wyoming territory, with clouds gathering heavy and dark over the mountain peaks. Jack woke to find Scout sitting alert beside the dying, embers of their fire, golden eyes fixed on something moving in the distance. Following the pup's gaze, Jack spotted a small herd of antelope picking their way delicately across the valley floor, their movements graceful and cautious in the morning mist. "Good eyes," Jack murmured, impressed by Scout's alertness. The little wolf's head turned at the sound of his voice, tail giving a tentative wag that spoke of growing comfort with their partnership. Jack rebuilt the fire and set water to boil for coffee, trying to establish a routine that would work for both of them. Scout watched every movement with intense concentration, as if memorizing the patterns that governed this new life. When Jack pulled out his pocket watch to check the time, 6:15, right on schedule for morning feeding, Scout's ears perked. "With recognition, you're already learning, aren't you?" Jack said, offering the pup a larger portion of jerky than the night feedings. "Smart enough to know when breakfast is coming." As Scout ate, Jack studied the terrain ahead. The trail to Laramie wound through increasingly rough country, with fewer places to find shelter and fresh water. Traveling with a young wolf would slow his pace considerably, but Jack found himself already adjusting his plans to accommodate his new companion's needs. After breaking camp, Jack lifted Scout onto Jasper's saddle, settling the pup in front of him where he could keep watch for signs of exhaustion or distress. The little wolf accepted the elevation with remarkable calm, as if riding horseback was a perfectly natural experience for a creature born to run on 4 legs. "We'll take it slow today," Jack explained, guiding Jasper into an easy walk along the creek bed. "Build up your strength before we tackle the harder trails." Scout's ears swiveled constantly as they rode, tracking sounds Jack couldn't hear and processing information about their surroundings with an intensity that reminded him of the best scouts he'd known during his law enforcement days. The pup was mapping their route, learning the rhythm of travel, preparing himself for whatever lay ahead. By midday, they'd covered only half the distance Jack normally would have managed alone, but he felt oddly satisfied with their progress. Scout had grown comfortable enough to doze against Jack's chest, the steady rhythm of Jasper's gait apparently soothing to the young wolf. The trust implicit in that relaxation moved Jack more than he cared to admit. They stopped for rest beside a stand of cottonwoods where the creek formed a small pool. While Jasper drank and grazed, Jack used his knife to carve a simple whistle from a piece of dry willow wood. The work was meditative, reminding him of countless evenings spent whittling by firelight during cattle drives and lonely camps. Scout watched the carving process with fascination, occasionally sniffing at the wood shavings that fell around Jack's boots. When the whistle was finished, Jack tested its tone, a clear, penetrating note that would carry well across open country. "This is for you," Jack told Scout, demonstrating how the sound changed when he covered and uncovered the finger. "Holes, different calls, for different meanings. We'll start simple. 1 long note means come to me, 2 short ones mean danger, 3 quick ones mean stay hidden." He practiced the calls while Scout listened intently, the pup's head tilting with each a variation in tone. After several repetitions, Jack gave 1 long, clear whistle and was amazed to see Scout immediately trot to his side, sitting expectantly as if waiting for further instructions. "Either you're the smartest wolf pup in the territory, or I'm a better teacher than I thought," Jack said, scratching behind Scout's good ear. The gesture earned him a contented rumble that was almost like a cat's purr, another sign that this little creature was far from ordinary. They were preparing to move on when Jack spotted dust rising from the trail behind them. 3 riders, moving fast and pushing their horses harder than the terrain really allowed. Something about their approach set off every alarm Jack's instincts could muster. He quickly gathered their gear and led Jasper into the concealment of the cottonwoods, pulling Scout close and signaling for silence. The riders thundered past without slowing, but not before Jack caught sight of the red bandanas they wore around their necks and the hard, predatory expressions on their faces. The Crimson Gang. Even this far from Cedar Falls, Jack recognized the signs of Red Morrison's crew. They rode with the casual arrogance of men who'd never met serious opposition, their horses bearing the marks of hard travel over long distances. But why were they here? And why were they riding so hard toward Laramie? A cold certainty settled in Jack's stomach as he realized the riders had been following his route, tracking him with a patience and persistence that spoke of personal vendetta rather than random opportunity. Scout pressed against Jack's leg, sensing his tension, even though the little wolf couldn't possibly understand the nature of the threat. Those amber eyes held questions Jack couldn't answer, concerns about dangers that went far beyond anything a wild creature would need to fear. "Change of plans, partner," Jack whispered, lifting Scout back onto Jasper's saddle. "We're taking the long way to Laramie. Those men aren't the kind of company we want to keep." Instead of following the main trail, Jack turned east toward the rougher country where the mountains met the plains. It would add days to their journey and test both Scout's endurance and Jasper's sure-footedness, but it would also make them much harder to track. As they climbed away from the creek, Jack found himself remembering the last time he'd seen Red Morrison. The outlaw leader had sworn vengeance as Jack led him away in shackles, promising that their paths would cross again when the law wasn't there to protect the righteous deputy sheriff. At the time, Jack had dismissed the threat as empty, bluster from a defeated criminal. But Sarah's death had changed everything, stripping away Jack's faith in justice and sending him fleeing into the wilderness to escape both his failures and his guilt. He'd thought distance and time would keep his past buried, but the Crimson Gang's presence suggested that some debts followed a man no matter how far he ran. Scouts seemed to sense the change in their circumstances, becoming more alert and watchful as they climbed higher into the mountains. The pup's natural instincts were already adapting to the presence of human predators, adding another layer to the survival skills he'd need in the weeks ahead. That evening, Jack made a cold camp in a hidden canyon where their fire wouldn't be visible from the trail below. As he fed Scout by moonlight, he found himself explaining their situation to the little wolf, as if the creature could understand every word. "Those men want to hurt me for something I did years ago," Jack said quietly. "I was trying to protect innocent people, but things went wrong. Now they're hunting me, and that means they're hunting you too." Scout listened with that remarkable attention, head tilted as if processing not just the words, but the emotions behind them. When Jack finished speaking, the pup moved closer and rested his chin on Jack's knee, a gesture of comfort that seemed far too knowing for such a young animal. "We'll figure this out," Jack promised, stroking Scout's soft fur. "We've got each other now, and that means we're not facing this alone." The whistle gleamed silver in the moonlight where Jack had set it, beside his bedroll, ready for instant use if danger found them in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and harder choices, but tonight they were safe in their hidden canyon. Two unlikely companions learning to trust in the face of uncertain odds. The fever came on during their third day in the mountains, striking Scout with a suddenness that left Jack feeling helpless and afraid. The little wolf had been walking beside Jasper for most of the morning, showing no signs of distress beyond the normal fatigue of a young animal adapting to long-distance travel. Then, as they stopped to rest beside a mountain stream, Scout suddenly stumbled and lay down heavily, his breathing shallow and rapid. Jack was off Jasper's back in an instant, kneeling beside his small companion with growing alarm. Scout's nose was hot and dry, his golden eyes glazed with the unmistakable dullness of serious illness. When Jack gently lifted the pup's front paw to examine it, he found what he'd feared. The scratches he'd noticed that first night had become infected, red streaks of poison spreading up towards Scout's shoulder. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, though his own hands were shaking as he assessed the damage. "We're going to fix this, I promise." But even as he spoke the words, Jack felt the familiar weight of promises he might not be able to keep. He'd made similar vows before, to Sarah, to the people of Cedar Falls, to everyone who'd trusted him to protect them from the dangers that stalked the frontier. Too many of those promises had ended in grief and regret. Scout whimpered softly, a sound so full of trust and vulnerability that it cut straight through Jack's heart. This little creature was depending on him completely, with the absolute faith that only the very young could offer. The responsibility was terrifying and precious in equal measure. Jack quickly made camp in the shelter of a massive boulder that would hide them from casual observation while still allowing access to fresh water. He built a small fire using dry wood that would produce minimal smoke, then set about creating a makeshift medical kit from his limited supplies. His saddlebags yielded a small bottle of whiskey, meant for emergencies exactly like this one. A clean shirt could be torn into bandages, and his razor would serve to trim away the matted fur around Scout's infected wounds. The tin of salve he'd brought out that first night would help, but Jack knew the real healing would require more than frontier medicine could provide. "Hold still for me, partner," Jack said softly, beginning the delicate work of cleaning Scout's infected paw. The little wolf lay quietly, despite what must have been considerable pain, trusting Jack to help rather than harm. As he worked, Jack found his mind drifting to another time, another place where he'd tried desperately to save something precious. His sister Emma had been only 7 when the fever took her, too young to understand why the medicine wasn't working, why their mother cried so quietly in the kitchen, while their father rode through blizzards searching for a doctor who never came. Jack had sat by Emma's bedside for 3 days and nights, reading to her from the fairy tales she loved, promising her that everything would be all right. But children's stories couldn't hold back death, and promises meant nothing against the brutal realities of frontier life. When Emma finally slipped away on that cold February morning, Jack had learned his first hard lesson about the limits of love and determination. Now, 25 years later, he found himself fighting the same battle with different stakes. Scout's fever was climbing, his small body burning with heat that spoke of infections spreading through his system. Jack bathed the pup with cool creek water, forcing drops of water between his lips when Scout became too weak to drink on his own. "Come on, boy," Jack whispered, his voice rough with emotion he thought he'd buried years ago. "You're tougher than you look. I've seen you survive things that would kill most creatures twice your size." Scout's eyes fluttered open at the sound of Jack's voice, focusing with obvious effort on his human companion's face. The trust in that gaze was absolute and unwavering, even in the grip of serious illness. Whatever wild instincts might have warned Scout to flee from human contact had been completely overridden by the bond forming between them. Jack pulled his pocket watch from his vest, checking the time with mechanical precision, even as his world narrowed to this small circle of firelight and the labored breathing of one young wolf. 4 hours since the last dose of willow bark tea, the frontier remedy for fever that might or might not help a creature whose body chemistry was so different from human. As night fell, Jack found himself keeping vigil the way he'd learned to do during his law enforcement years, alert for external threats while simultaneously monitoring the most important danger, which was internal and beyond his power to fight directly. Scout's breathing had steadied somewhat, but his temperature remained dangerously high. "You know," Jack said quietly, needing to fill the silence with something other than his own fears, "my sister Emma used to collect wounded animals. Birds with broken wings, rabbits that got caught by cats, once even a fox kit that had been orphaned. She had a gift for healing things that seemed beyond help." Scout's ear twitched at the sound of Jack's voice, though his eyes remained closed. Jack took that as encouragement to continue. "Our mother always said Emma saw something in those hurt creatures that the rest of us missed. Not just their wounds, but their will to live. She believed that sometimes the desire to get better was more important than any medicine." Jack carefully cleaned Scout's infected paw again, pleased to see that the red streaks seemed no worse than before. The whiskey had done its work as a disinfectant, and the regular cleaning was keeping the infection from spreading further. "Emma would have liked you," Jack continued, applying fresh salve to the cleaned wounds. "She always said the smartest. Animals were the ones that knew when to trust humans and when to stay wild. You've got that balance figured out better than most people I've met." As the night deepened, Jack settled into a rhythm of care that felt both foreign and familiar. Every 2 hours, he checked Scout's temperature and gave him water. Every 4 hours, he cleaned the wounds and applied fresh medicine. Between treatments, he kept talking. Stories from his childhood, memories of animals he'd known, anything that might provide a human voice for Scout to follow back from the edge of serious illness. The turning point came just before dawn, when Scout lifted his head unprompted and managed to drink from Jack's cupped hand without assistance. The fever was breaking, leaving the little wolf weak but alert, his golden eyes clear for the first time in 24 hours. "That's my boy," Jack said, relief flooding through him like physical warmth. "I knew you were tougher than any infection." Scout tried to stand, wobbled, then settled for lifting his head enough to lick Jack's hand, a gesture of gratitude that spoke louder than words. In that moment, Jack realized that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer a man and a wolf sharing temporary convenience. They had become something rarer and more valuable, true companions who would stand by each other through whatever trials lay ahead. As Jack prepared Scout's first real meal in 2 days, he found himself thinking about promises again. This time, though, the vow he made was different. Not a desperate pledge to prevent the inevitable, but a calm commitment to honor the bond they'd forged through shared danger and mutual care. "We're partners now," he told Scout, watching the pup eat with returning appetite. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Scout's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Within 2 days of the fever breaking, the little wolf was walking steadily beside Jasper again, his infected paw healing, cleanly under Jack's careful ministrations. But more than his physical improvement, it was Scout's growing awareness and intelligence that continued to amaze Jack. The pup had begun responding to subtle hand signals without any formal training, as if he could read Jack's intentions directly from his posture and expressions. When Jack needed to move quietly through areas where they might be observed, Scout automatically dropped low and matched his pace to Jack's careful steps. When danger might be approaching, Scout would position himself between Jack and the potential threat, despite being too small to offer any real protection. Most intriguing of all, Scout had started exhibiting behaviors that seemed more domestic dog than wild wolf. He would retrieve items that Jack dropped, bring him interesting objects he found during their travels, and even attempt rudimentary games that required understanding of human recreational concepts. It was as if some part of Scout's heritage remembered what it meant to be a partner to humans rather than their enemy. "Your mother wasn't entirely wild, was she?" Jack mused, as they made camp on the 4th evening after Scout's illness. The little wolf sat attentively nearby, head tilted in that characteristic expression of intense listening. "I'd bet money that somewhere in your bloodline there's a dog who cast his lot with a wolf pack." The observation explained much about Scout's unusual combination of wild instincts and domestic inclinations. It also made Jack more hopeful about their future together. If Scout carried even partial dog heritage, he might be able to adapt to human companionship in ways that would have been impossible for a purely wild animal. That evening, as Jack prepared their simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Scout suddenly froze in place, every muscle tense with alert attention. His nose lifted to test the wind, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest, the first truly aggressive sound Jack had heard from his companion. Jack immediately reached for his rifle, following Scout's gaze toward a cluster of rocks about 200 yards from their camp. For several minutes, neither man nor wolf moved, both straining to detect whatever had triggered Scout's warning. Then Jack saw it. A flash of red fabric among the grey stones, there and gone so quickly he might have missed it if Scout hadn't directed his attention. Moving with careful stealth, Jack worked his way toward the rocks, while Scout remained at the camp, ready to flee if the situation demanded it. What Jack found among the stones made his blood run cold with recognition. A crimson bandana, still damp with sweat and carrying the distinct smell of horse and unwashed man. Tied around it was a piece of paper with a message scrawled in crude handwriting. "We know you're out here, Sterling. Every trail leads somewhere, and we've got time to follow them all. R.M. Red Morrison." The name alone was enough to bring back memories Jack had spent 5 years trying to forget. Morrison had been the leader of the Crimson Gang during their reign of terror across 3 territories. A man whose cruelty was matched only by his cunning and his absolute refusal to forgive perceived wrongs. Jack had first encountered Morrison during a bank robbery in the town of Millerville, where the outlaw had taken hostages to ensure his escape. But Jack's intervention had gone wrong, leading to a shootout that left Morrison's younger brother dead and the gang leader himself facing a lengthy prison sentence. Morrison had sworn vengeance during his trial, promising that he would hunt Jack Sterling to the ends of the earth if necessary. The outlaw had escaped during a prisoner transport 3 years later, killing 2 guards in the process. Since then, he'd rebuilt his gang and resumed his criminal activities with a new focus, tracking down the former deputy sheriff who had cost him both his brother and his freedom. Jack crumpled the note and stuffed it into his pocket, his mind racing through the implications of Morrison's presence. The outlaw wouldn't be alone. He never traveled with fewer than 4 men, all of them experienced killers who shared their leader's taste for violence. And if they were close enough to leave messages, they were close enough to attack without warning. Returning to camp, Jack found Scout watching him with those increasingly expressive amber eyes. The little wolf seemed to sense the gravity of their situation, moving closer to Jack's side as if offering whatever protection his small size would allow. "We've got big trouble, partner," Jack said quietly, beginning to pack their gear with swift efficiency. "The kind of men who are hunting us don't give up, and they don't show mercy to anything they see as standing in their way." As if to emphasize his point, the distant sound of horses moving through the darkness reached them from somewhere down the valley. Multiple riders, moving with the confidence of men who knew their quarry was trapped and running out of places to hide. Jack quickly saddled Jasper and lifted Scout onto the horse's back, his mind already planning their escape route. The terrain ahead was rough and dangerous, especially for night travel, but it offered their only chance of avoiding a confrontation they couldn't possibly win. As they rode away from their campsite, Jack found himself thinking about the pattern of Morrison's pursuit. The outlaw was skilled at tracking, but more than that, he was patient and methodical. He wasn't simply chasing Jack randomly across the wilderness. He was driving him towards some predetermined destination where the final confrontation would take place on Morrison's terms. "The question is," Jack muttered to himself as they climbed higher into the mountains, "where does he want me to go, and what's waiting for me when I get there?" Scout pressed closer against Jack's chest, seemingly offering comfort in the face of dangers that went far beyond anything in his limited experience. The gesture reminded Jack that he was no longer responsible only for his own survival. He now had a companion whose life depended on the choices he made in the hours and days ahead. The realization was both terrifying and oddly comforting. For 5 years, Jack had lived with the freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. Now he had Scout to consider, and that responsibility gave him something he'd been missing since Sarah's death, a reason to care about the outcome of his struggles. "Don't worry, boy," Jack whispered as they disappeared into the maze of canyons and hidden trails that crisscrossed the high country. "I've survived worse than Red Morrison before. This time, I've got help." Scout's response was a soft rumble of contentment that spoke of absolute trust in his human companion's ability to keep them both safe. It was a faith Jack hoped he could prove worthy of, because their lives might well depend on the bond they'd forged through shared danger and mutual care. Behind them, the sound of pursuing horses grew fainter as the distance increased. But Jack knew Morrison wouldn't give up easily. The hunt had become personal years ago, and men like Red Morrison never stopped until they'd claimed their revenge or died in the attempt. 2 weeks of careful travel through the high country had brought Jack and Scout to the edge of the settled territories, where mountain trails gave way to established roads, and the smoke of distant homesteads could be seen rising into the clear morning air. For the first time since leaving the valley where they'd first met, Jack found himself questioning the wisdom of keeping Scout as a companion. The little wolf had grown considerably during their time together, his coat thickening with the approach of winter, and his body filling out as regular meals restored his strength. But it was Scout's mental development that truly amazed Jack. The pup seemed to learn new concepts with every passing day, responding to increasingly complex commands and even anticipating Jack's needs before they were expressed. That morning, as Jack sat by their campfire planning the day's route, Scout had approached carrying something in his mouth. At first, Jack thought it was just another stick or interesting rock that had caught the pup's attention. But when Scout dropped his, offering beside Jack's coffee cup, it proved to be something far more significant. It was a piece of deer antler, naturally shed and weathered smooth by years of mountain weather. But someone, or something, had carved crude symbols into its surface, creating a primitive totem that seemed to blend the artistic traditions of both Native American tribes and frontier folk art. How Scout had found such an object in the wilderness was mysterious enough, but the fact that he'd recognized it as something worth bringing to Jack spoke to an intelligence that went far beyond normal animal awareness. "Where did you find this, boy?" Jack asked, turning the carved bone over in his hands. The symbols seemed to tell a story. A man and a wolf, side by side, facing some common threat. It was exactly the kind of gift that might pass between human friends, offered not for any practical purpose, but as a gesture of affection and shared understanding. Scout sat watching Jack's reaction with obvious pleasure, his tail wagging slowly, as if he understood that his gift had been well received. The gesture was so human-like in its emotional sophistication that Jack felt a chill of wonder mixed with unease. What exactly was Scout becoming under his influence? And was it fair to encourage such development in a creature born to be wild? These questions became more pressing as they encountered their first group of travelers since leaving the high mountains. A family of homesteaders was making their way north with a wagon full of household goods and farming implements, clearly seeking new land to claim and cultivate. Under normal circumstances, Jack would have been glad for the company and the news such travelers might carry about conditions ahead. But the moment the family's patriarch spotted Scout walking calmly beside Jasper, the atmosphere changed completely. The man's hand went immediately to the rifle propped against his wagon seat, while his wife gathered their children protectively behind her. "That's a wolf," the homesteader said, his voice tight with fear and suspicion. "Mister, you've got a wild animal there that could turn on you, or us, without warning." Jack felt Scout press closer against his leg, sensing the hostility in the man's voice even if he couldn't understand the words. The little wolf's posture was submissive and non-threatening, but Jack could see that his peaceful demeanor meant nothing to people whose knowledge of wolves came from stories of livestock, killings and predatory attacks. "He's no danger to anyone," Jack said carefully, keeping his own voice calm and reasonable. "Scout here is more like a dog than a wolf, and he's never shown aggression toward humans." "Scout?" The woman's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You've named that creature? Mister, that animal is going to grow up into a killer. It's in their nature. You can't change what something is born to be." Jack found himself facing a choice he'd been avoiding since the day he first shared his food with a starving wolf pup. The civilized world he was attempting to rejoin had no place for creatures like Scout, no understanding of the bond that could exist between human and wolf. To gain acceptance from people like these homesteaders, he would have to abandon the companion who had trusted him completely. "I appreciate your concern," Jack said finally, "but Scout and I will be traveling on separately. We wouldn't want to make your family uncomfortable." The relief on the homesteaders' faces was immediate and obvious. They were good people, Jack realized, but their fear of the unknown was stronger than their curiosity about what might be possible between different species. As he led Jasper and Scout away from the wagon train, Jack could hear the family discussing his decision in voices that mixed pity with disapproval. "That man's going to get himself killed," the father was saying. "Wild animals can't be trusted no matter how tame they seem. It's only a matter of time before that wolf shows its true nature." Scout looked back at the departing travelers with what Jack could only interpret as sadness. The little wolf had seemed genuinely interested in meeting new humans, his tail wagging hopefully as they'd approached the wagon. The rejection had clearly confused and hurt him, though he'd shown no sign of anger or aggression in response to their fear. "I'm sorry, boy," Jack said quietly as they made camp that evening well away from the main trail. "Most people won't understand what we have together. They can't see past what you are to who you've become." But even as he spoke the words, Jack found himself wondering if the homesteaders might be right. Was he being foolishly naive about Scout's true nature? The little wolf was still young and dependent. What would happen as he grew larger and stronger? Would the wild instincts eventually reassert themselves, overriding the domestic behaviors he'd learned? As if sensing Jack's doubts, Scout moved to sit directly in front of him, golden eyes fixed on his human companion's face with an intensity that seemed almost human in its emotional depth. Then, deliberately and gently, Scout placed one paw on Jack's knee, a gesture of reassurance that spoke louder than any words. In that moment, Jack realized that the question wasn't whether Scout would remain loyal as he grew older. The real question was whether Jack himself had the courage to honor their bond, regardless of what others might think or say. The homesteaders represented the conventional wisdom of frontier society, but that same society had already judged Jack himself unfit for normal human companionship. "You know what?" Jack said, reaching out to scratch behind Scout's ears. "Maybe being outcasts together isn't such a bad thing. We understand each other, and that's worth more than the approval of people who are too afraid to see what's right." In front of them, Scout's response was a contented rumble that vibrated through his entire small body. He settled down beside Jack's feet, resting his chin on his paws in a posture of complete trust and satisfaction. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners, not man and beast, but two thinking, feeling creatures who had chosen each other despite all the reasons they should have remained apart. The carved bone totem caught the firelight, where Jack had placed it beside his bedroll, its primitive symbols seeming to dance in the flickering flames. A man and a wolf standing together against the world. It was an accurate representation of their situation, Jack realized, and perhaps a prophecy of what they were destined to become. The abandoned trading post sat like a weathered skeleton against the grey October sky, its broken windows staring emptily across the valley where Jack and Scout had stopped to rest. What had once been a thriving hub of frontier commerce was now nothing more than rotting timber and broken dreams, another casualty of the railroad's relentless march westward. Scout was investigating the remains of what had been the post's stable, his nose twitching as he processed scents left by long-departed horses and travelers. Jack watched him with the fond attention that had become second nature over their weeks together, marveling again at the little wolf's endless curiosity about the human world. It was while Scout was digging beneath a fallen beam that he uncovered something that would change everything between them. A piece of paper, yellow with age and stained with what looked like dried blood, fluttered in the autumn wind as Scout pulled it free from its hiding place. The pup brought it to Jack with the same careful attention he'd shown to all his previous gifts, clearly proud of his discovery. Jack's blood turned to ice water as he unfolded the paper and saw his own face staring back at him from a wanted poster dated 5 years earlier. But this wasn't the clean, law-abiding deputy sheriff he'd once been. This was Jack Sterling, as he'd appeared during the darkest period of his life, gaunt, wild-eyed, and wanted for murder. Wanted dead or alive, the poster proclaimed in bold letters beneath a sketch that captured perfectly the haunted expression Jack had worn after Sarah's death. Jack Sterling, murder, armed robbery, conspiracy to commit felony, reward $2,000. Scout sat watching Jack's face as he read, tilting his head with that characteristic expression of concern whenever Jack's emotions became too intense. But once Jack couldn't bring himself to offer the reassuring words that usually came so easily. How could he explain to his loyal companion that everything Scout thought he knew about their partnership was built on lies? The poster brought back memories Jack had spent years trying to bury. After Sarah's death, during the bank robbery gone wrong, he'd spiraled into a darkness that consumed everything good in his nature. Instead of pursuing Red Morrison and his gang through legal channels, Jack had turned in his badge and embarked on a private war of vengeance that quickly crossed every line he'd once sworn to protect. He'd tracked Morrison's gang for months, picking them off one by one with the skills he'd learned as a lawman, but none of the restraint that badge had represented. When he'd finally cornered Morrison's younger brother Danny in a saloon in Deadwood, the confrontation had ended in gunfire that left Danny dead, and Jack branded as a killer in the eyes of the law. The irony was that the shooting had been self-defense. Morrison had drawn first, forcing Jack to choose between his own life and his already tattered reputation. But witnesses had been scarce and unreliable, and Jack's recent behavior had made it easy for local authorities to believe the worst about his motives. "I never told you," Jack said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind whistling through the trading post's broken walls. "I never told you what I really was before we met." Scout's ears perked forward at the sound of Jack's voice, but there was something different in his posture now, a wariness that hadn't been there moments before. Could the little wolf somehow sense the weight of the revelations contained in that blood-stained paper? Jack forced himself to continue, knowing that Scout deserved to know the truth about the man he'd chosen to trust. "I was a deputy sheriff once, sworn to uphold the law and protect innocent people. But when the law failed me, when it failed, Sarah, I became something else entirely. I became the kind of man that good people hire other men to hunt down and kill." The wanted poster trembled in Jack's hands as he struggled with emotions he'd thought he'd conquered years ago. Shame, regret, and a bone-deep weariness that came from carrying secrets too heavy for one man to bear alone. "Red Morrison and his gang are hunting us because I killed his brother," Jack continued, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "Not in a fair fight as a lawman, but as a vigilante seeking personal revenge. I crossed lines that should never be crossed. And now, those choices are coming back to threaten not just me, but you too." Scout moved closer, pressing against Jack's leg with the same gentle insistence he'd shown during Jack's moments of doubt and fear. But Jack pulled away, unable to accept comfort he didn't deserve. "Don't you understand?" Jack's voice was harsh, with self-condemnation. "I'm not the good man you think I am. I'm exactly the kind of dangerous outcast that family back on the trail was right to fear. You've been traveling with a killer, Scout. A man who threw away everything decent about himself for the sake of revenge." As if summoned by Jack's confession, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley, multiple riders, moving with the steady purpose that meant they'd found what they were looking for. Jack quickly stuffed the wanted poster into his pocket and grabbed his rifle, but he knew it was too late for escape. Morrison had finally cornered him in this isolated place, where there would be no witnesses and no law to interfere with whatever justice the outlaw leader chose to dispense. Scout seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, even without comprehending the specific nature of the threat. The little wolf's entire posture changed, becoming alert and ready for fight or flight as he positioned himself between Jack and the approaching sound of hoofbeats. "You need to go," Jack told him urgently, pointing toward the heavy timber that covered the mountainside beyond the trading post. "Run, Scout. Get as far away from here as you can. This isn't your fight, and there's no reason for you to die because of my mistakes." But Scout didn't move. Instead, he sat down firmly beside Jack's feet and fixed his amber eyes on his human companion's face with an expression of absolute determination. It was a look that said more clearly than words, "I'm staying with you no matter what happens." The first rider appeared at the edge of the tree line, a hard-faced man wearing the distinctive red bandana that marked him as one of Morrison's gang. 3 more followed, spreading out to surround the trading post with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Red Morrison himself was the last to appear, riding slowly down the slope with the calm confidence of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. He was older than Jack remembered, his face marked by hard years and harder choices, but his eyes still held the same cold intelligence that had made him so dangerous. "Jack Sterling," Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "It's been a long time since Cedar Falls. I told you then that we'd meet again, and here we are." Jack stepped out from behind the trading post's broken wall, rifle ready, but not yet aimed. Scout remained at his side, a small but determined presence that seemed absurdly brave in the face of such overwhelming odds. "Morrison," Jack acknowledged, keeping his voice steady despite the fear and regret churning in his stomach. "I wondered when you'd finally track me down. 5 years I've been hunting you," Morrison said, dismounting slowly, while his men kept their weapons trained on Jack. 5 years of following cold trails and false leads, all for the chance to look into your eyes when I tell you how my brother died. Danny drew first, Jack said quietly. It was self-defense, and we both know it. Morrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Self-defense? You hunted my family like animals, Sterling. You tracked Danny for 3 months before you cornered him in that saloon. That's not self-defense. That's murder with a badge. The accusation hit harder than Jack had expected, because it contained enough truth to cut deep. He had hunted Danny. Morrison, driven by grief and rage that had transformed him into something barely human. The fact that the final confrontation had been technically legal didn't change the darkness that had motivated it. You're right, Jack said, surprising both Morrison and himself with the admission. I became something I swore I'd never be. I let revenge turn me into a killer, and I've carried that guilt every day since. Morrison's eyes narrowed with suspicion. You think an apology is going to save you now? No, Jack replied, glancing down at Scout, who was still sitting calmly beside him, despite the mortal danger they faced. I think it's too late for apologies. But maybe it's not too late for one last decent act. He looked directly at Scout, willing the little wolf to understand what he was about to say. This is your chance, boy. Run now, while they're focused on me. Live wild and free the way you were meant to. Don't let my mistakes cost you your life. But Scout's response was to move even closer to Jack's side, pressing against his leg with a loyalty that transcended species and circumstance. The message was clear. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Morrison noticed the exchange with evident amusement. Touching, he said mockingly. The great Jack Sterling reduced to talking to animals. I think I'll kill your pet first, let you watch him die before I finish you. The threat crystallized something hard and cold in Jack's chest. His past sins were his own to answer for, but Scout had done nothing to deserve the vengeance of men who dealt in death and cruelty. If this was to be their last stand, Jack would make sure it counted for something more than just satisfying an old grudge. The wolf isn't part of this, Jack said, his voice carrying the authority he'd once worn. With a badge. Your quarrel is with me, Morrison. Leave him out of it. I don't think so, Morrison replied, drawing his gun with casual malice. You took my brother from me. Now I take everything from you. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, neither side willing to make the first move that would turn this remote trading post into a battleground. Red Morrison and his 3 men held the tactical advantage of numbers and position, but they were clearly reluctant to rush an opponent whose reputation for deadly accuracy had preceded him across multiple territories. Jack used the time to study his opponents and the terrain, his lawman's training reasserting itself despite the years that had passed since he'd worn a badge. Morrison's men were professional killers, but they were also overconfident, used to intimidating their targets into submission rather than facing serious resistance. That overconfidence might be the only edge Jack could exploit. You know, Morrison said conversationally, still holding his gun but not yet aiming it, I've always wondered what happened to the great Jack Sterling after Cedar Falls. Some said you'd died of shame, others claimed you'd run all the way to California and taken up farming. I never imagined I'd find you playing nursemaid to a wild animal. Scout remained pressed against Jack's leg, his small body tense with awareness of the danger surrounding them. The little wolf's courage, in the face of such overwhelming odds, filled Jack with a fierce protectiveness that went beyond anything he'd felt since Sarah's death. Time's up, Sterling, Morrison announced, raising his weapon. Say goodbye to your pet. The gunshot that followed wasn't aimed at Scout. It was Jack's rifle barking defiance as he put a bullet through the crown of Morrison's hat, sending the outlaw leader diving for cover behind a pile of rotting lumber. The message was clear. This wouldn't be the easy execution Morrison had been expecting. Scout, with me, Jack commanded, grabbing the little wolf and rolling behind the trading post's collapsed front wall as bullets began flying from multiple directions. The thick timber provided adequate cover for the moment, but Jack knew their position was far from defensible against 4 armed men with time and ammunition to spare. As bullets whined overhead, Jack found himself thinking with the cold clarity that had once made him an effective lawman. Morrison's gang was spread out in a rough semicircle, but they were positioned for intimidation rather than tactical advantage. If Jack could reach the stable ruins behind the trading post, he'd have better cover and multiple escape routes. "When I give the signal," Jack whispered to Scout, "you run for those trees on the ridge. Keep running until you can't hear the gunfire anymore. Find a pack to take you in, or learn to hunt on your own. Either way, you'll have a chance." Scout's response was to press closer against Jack's side, his amber eyes fixed on his human companion's face with an expression of absolute refusal. The little wolf wasn't leaving, no matter what arguments Jack might offer. The shooting stopped as Morrison's men reloaded, giving Jack the opportunity he'd been waiting for. He sprinted from their current position to the stable ruins, Scout keeping pace beside him despite the continued danger. More bullets followed their movement, but the distance and Jack's erratic running pattern kept them safe for the moment. The stable provided better cover and, more importantly, access to the saddlebags. Jack had left with Jasper when they'd first approached the trading post. Among his supplies was something he hadn't looked at in 5 years, something that might change the nature of this confrontation entirely. Wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his gear was a small leather case containing the sheriff's badge he'd worn in Cedar Falls. Jack had carried it through all his wandering years, unable to throw it away despite everything it represented about his failures and lost honor. Now, as bullets continued to search for him among the stable's broken beams, he found himself staring at the tarnished star with emotions too complex to name. "You want to know who I really am?" Jack called out to Morrison and his men. "I'll show you." He pinned the badge to his shirt front, the metal cold against his chest, but somehow comforting in its familiar weight. For the first time in 5 years, Jack Sterling was again wearing the symbol of law and justice, even if the only court that mattered now would be decided by gunfire. Scout watched this transformation with intense interest, his head tilted as if trying to understand the significance of the small metal star. When Jack knelt down to the little wolf's level, Scout moved forward to sniff the badge, his nose twitching with curiosity. "This is what I used to be," Jack explained quietly, aware that Morrison's men were moving to surround their position, but needing Scout to understand. "Before the darkness took hold, I was sworn to protect people like you, the innocent ones who can't protect themselves. I failed at that job, Scout. I let revenge and anger turn me into something I was never meant to be." Scout pressed his nose against the badge, then looked up at Jack with those remarkable amber eyes. In that gaze, Jack saw something he hadn't expected. Not judgment or fear, but acceptance. Scout had heard Jack's story and found him worthy of loyalty despite his past mistakes. "But maybe," Jack continued, scratching behind Scout's ears one last time, "maybe I can get it right this once. Maybe I can remember what it means to stand between good people and those who do them harm." The sound of boots crunching on broken glass announced that Morrison's men were closing in. Jack checked his rifle and counted his remaining ammunition. Enough for a good fight, but probably not enough to win against 4 experienced gunmen. Still, he'd faced worse odds during his law enforcement days, and he'd had partners then who'd trusted him to see them through to the other side. Scout seemed to understand that their planning time was over. The little wolf moved to a position where he could watch for approaching enemies while still staying close enough to Jack to coordinate their defense. It was the kind of tactical thinking that belonged more to a trained military scout than a young wolf, but Jack had long since stopped questioning Scout's remarkable intelligence. "Here's what we're going to do," Jack whispered, outlining a defense plan that utilized the stable's multiple exits and the uneven terrain around the trading post. Scout listened with the intense concentration he'd shown to all of Jack's previous lessons, absorbing information that might mean the difference between life and death. As he spoke, Jack found himself remembering another conversation from years past, his final discussion with the town marshal who'd tried to talk him out of pursuing personal vengeance against the Morrison gang. The old man had warned that revenge was a poison that destroyed everything it touched, leaving only emptiness where honor and purpose had once lived. The badge isn't just a piece of metal, Marshal Henderson had said. It's a promise you make to something bigger than yourself. When you throw that away for personal satisfaction, you lose more than your job. You lose your soul. Jack had dismissed those words at the time, too consumed by grief and rage to hear their wisdom. But now, pinned down by the very criminals he'd once sworn to bring to justice, he finally understood what the old marshal had been trying to tell him. The badge represented not just authority, but responsibility. Not just power, but service. And most importantly, it symbolized the choice to stand for justice even when, especially when, personal cost was involved. "Morrison!" Jack called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd once wielded as a lawman. "This doesn't have to end with more killing. Your quarrel is with me, not with anyone else who might be traveling these roads. Let's settle this like men, face to face." Morrison's laughter echoed across the ruins of the trading post. "You think that badge makes you righteous again, Sterling? You think you can just pin on a star and forget about the blood on your hands?" "No," Jack replied honestly. "I can't forget, and I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I can try to do better with whatever time I have left." Scout moved closer, pressing against Jack's leg with the same trust and loyalty he'd shown from their first night together. The gesture reminded Jack that he wasn't fighting just for his own redemption. He was fighting to protect the one pure relationship he'd managed to build from the wreckage of his old life. "You chose to stay with me, even after learning what I really was," Jack said quietly to Scout. "That means more to me than any badge or title ever could. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the best part of my life since Sarah died." Scout's response was a soft rumble of contentment that vibrated through his small body. It was the sound of a creature completely at peace with his choice, regardless of the consequences that choice might bring. The shuffling of footsteps announced that Morrison's final assault was about to begin. Jack positioned himself behind the best available cover, rifle ready, and his newly restored badge catching what little sunlight filtered through the broken roof of the stable. "Ready, partner?" he asked Scout, who had taken position where he could watch one of the stable's side entrances. Scout's tail gave a single, determined wag, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both courage and absolute loyalty in one simple movement. For the first time in 5 years, Deputy Sheriff Jack Sterling was ready to stand for law and justice, even if the only court was an abandoned trading post and the only jury was a young wolf who'd chosen to believe in second chances. The battle for redemption was about to begin. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Morrison's men, moving with the coordinated precision of wolves hunting prey. Jack's first shot dropped the gunman approaching from the east, but return fire immediately forced him back behind cover as bullets splintered the ancient wood around his position. Scout had disappeared into the maze of fallen beams and broken stalls that filled the stable's interior, becoming a grey shadow that moved with purpose through spaces too small for human pursuit. Jack caught glimpses of him darting between hiding spots, always staying close enough to help, but never presenting a clear target for Morrison's remaining men. "Give it up, Sterling!" Morrison's voice echoed from somewhere near the trading posts. "Front entrance. You're outgunned and outmanned. Make this easy on yourself and that animal you're so fond of." Jack's response was a rifle shot that sent Morrison diving for better cover. The deputy sheriff's aim was still true after all these years, but ammunition was limited and the odds were getting worse with each passing minute. The second gunman tried to flank them through the stable's rear entrance, moving carefully through the rubble with his weapon ready. He never saw Scout coming. The little wolf erupted from concealment like a grey lightning bolt, 30 pounds of fury and sharp teeth that struck the man's gun arm with surgical precision. The gunman's scream of pain and surprise echoed across the ruins as his weapon went flying. He tried to shake Scout off, but the little wolf hung on with grim determination, using his weight and leverage to drag the much larger man off balance. Jack took advantage of the distraction to put the gunman down with a clean shot, but even as the man fell, the third attacker was closing in from the opposite direction. This one had learned from his companion's mistake, keeping his distance while searching for a clear shot at either Jack or Scout. That's when Scout did something that transcended anything Jack had seen from the remarkable little wolf before. He lifted his muzzle toward the grey sky and released a howl that seemed to contain all the wildness and power of his ancestral heritage. The sound was haunting and primal, carrying across the valley with a resonance that spoke of pack bonds and territorial calls that had echoed through these mountains for countless generations. But this wasn't just a wolf calling to his own kind. It was a plea for help from a creature caught between two worlds, asking his wild relatives to aid in a battle that bridged the gap between civilization and wilderness. For a moment, the gunfight stopped entirely as all the humans present processed the implications of that otherworldly sound. Then, from the forested ridges surrounding the trading post, answering howls began to rise in response. One voice, then another, then a full chorus of wild wolves responding to Scout's call with the ancient loyalty that bound pack members across species lines. Jack felt the hair on his arms rise as he realized what his small companion had just accomplished. Scout had summoned reinforcements from a world that most humans never truly understood. Morrison's third gunman made the mistake of turning to look toward the tree line where the howling originated. Jack's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the broken ground. The man struggled to reach his sidearm with his uninjured hand, but Scout was already moving, covering the distance between them in 3 powerful bounds. This time, Scout didn't just attack, he herded, using the same instincts that had driven his ancestors to guide prey animals toward waiting pack members. The wounded gunman found himself being driven backward toward the edge of a steep drop-off, Scout's snapping teeth and aggressive posturing leaving him no choice but to retreat. When the man finally stumbled and fell over the edge, his cries fading. As he tumbled down the rocky slope, Scout trotted back to Jack with obvious satisfaction. The little wolf had neutralized a deadly threat without killing, showing a tactical intelligence that belonged more to a military strategist than a wild animal. But their temporary victory was interrupted by Morrison's roar of rage from his position near the trading post. "Enough games, Sterling! Time to finish this!" The outlaw leader emerged from cover with reckless fury, both guns blazing as he charged toward the stable. His wild shooting forced Jack to dive for deeper cover, but it also revealed Morrison's position to Scout, who had positioned himself for exactly this kind of opportunity. As Morrison closed the distance, Scout struck from his blind side, leaping from the top of a collapsed beam to land squarely on the outlaw's back. Morrison staggered under the unexpected weight, his shots going wide as Scout's claws raked across his gun hand. The howling from the surrounding forest was growing closer now, no longer just voices in the distance, but the sound of actual movement. Through the underbrush, Jack could see shapes moving between the trees, grey forms that flowed like smoke through the twilight, drawn by Scout's call and the scent of battle. Morrison managed to throw Scout off, but the little wolf had bought Jack the opening he needed. Rising from cover with his rifle already aimed, Jack found himself face to face with the man who had haunted his nightmares for 5 years. "Red Morrison," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of the badge he wore. "You're under arrest for murder, robbery, and conspiracy." Morrison's laugh was wild and desperate. "Arrest? You're no lawman, Sterling. You're just another killer with a guilty conscience." "Maybe," Jack acknowledged, keeping his rifle trained on Morrison's chest. "But I'm the killer with backup," as if summoned by his words, the first wild wolf emerged from the tree line, a massive alpha male with silver-tipped fur and eyes like winter ice. Behind him came others, a pack of 6 adult wolves drawn by Scout's call and prepared to honor the ancient bonds that connected all their kind. Scout trotted over to stand beside Jack, his small form somehow bridging the gap between the human world and the wild pack that had answered his summons. He was no longer just a wolf or just a companion. He had become something new, a translator between species who could call upon the best qualities of both. Morrison looked around at the wolves surrounding the trading post, his face pale with the realization that he was no longer the predator in this scenario. For the first time since Jack had known him, Red Morrison looked genuinely afraid. "Surrender now," Jack said, his rifle never wavering. "It's over, Morrison. You and your gang are finished." Red Morrison's surrender lasted exactly as long as it took him to spot the derringer hidden in his boot. Years of criminal cunning hadn't abandoned him, even surrounded by wolves and facing Jack's unwavering rifle. With a desperate lunge, he grabbed the small backup weapon and rolled behind a pile of rotting timber, gambling everything on one final, treacherous play. "You always were too trusting, Sterling," Morrison snarled, the derringer's small barrel glinting in the fading daylight. "That's what got your precious Sarah killed, and it's what's going to get you killed now." The words hit Jack like physical blows, but his aim never wavered. Around them, the wild pack circled with fluid grace, reading the tension between the two humans and preparing to act on instincts honed by generations of survival in hostile territory. Scout positioned himself between Jack and Morrison's hiding place, every muscle coiled for action. The little wolf's presence was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because Jack knew Scout would fight beside him to the end. Terrifying because Jack couldn't bear the thought of losing his loyal companion to Morrison's desperation. "Sarah died because of your greed and violence," Jack replied, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "She died because you and your gang chose to use innocent people as shields for your crimes, but her death doesn't have to be meaningless if it stops you from hurting anyone else." Morrison's laugh was edged with madness. "Noble words from a man who spent 2 years hunting my family like animals. You want to know something, Sterling? After Danny died, after you forced me to rebuild my gang from scratch, I made sure to ask about you in every town, every settlement, every campfire conversation from here to Texas." The outlaw leader's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "I know about the nightmares, Jack. I know about the drinking, the fights, the way you'd wake up screaming Sarah's name. I know you blamed yourself for her death, and you were right to. If you'd been faster, smarter, better, she'd still be alive." Each word was calculated to cut deep, to undermine Jack's hard-won peace and drag him back into the darkness that had consumed him after Cedar Falls. For a moment, Jack felt the familiar weight of guilt and self-recrimination threatening to overwhelm his newfound sense of purpose. But then Scout pressed against his leg, a warm, solid reminder of the bond they'd forged through shared danger and mutual trust. The little wolf's presence anchored Jack to the present moment, to the choice between justice and vengeance that would define not just this confrontation, but everything that came after. "You're right," Jack said quietly, surprising Morrison with the admission. "I was too slow, too late, too broken to save Sarah. But I'm not too broken to stop you from creating more victims, more families destroyed by your greed and cruelty." Morrison rose from cover with the derringer aimed directly at Scout, his finger already tightening on the trigger. "Then watch your new pet die the same way your woman did." The shot that followed came not from Morrison's derringer but from Jack's rifle, a clean, precise shot that sent the smaller weapon spinning away into the gathering darkness. Morrison screamed in pain and rage as the bullet shattered the bones in his gun hand, leaving him weaponless and desperate. But Morrison wasn't finished yet. With his uninjured hand, he grabbed a thick piece of timber and launched himself at Jack with the fury of a cornered animal. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling across the broken ground as they fought for control. Morrison was younger and driven by desperate fury, but Jack had the advantage of hard-earned experience and righteous purpose. More importantly, he wasn't fighting alone. Scout darted in and out of the struggle, his teeth finding every exposed piece of Morrison's anatomy without ever risking injury to Jack. The end came suddenly when Morrison, bleeding from multiple wounds and exhausted by his own rage, made one final grab for the knife at his belt. Scout saw the movement before Jack did, launching himself at Morrison's arm with every ounce of his small but powerful body. The impact sent Morrison tumbling backward toward the edge of the same drop-off where his last gunman had fallen. For a moment, he teetered on the brink, arms windmilling as he fought for balance. Then gravity claimed him, and Red Morrison disappeared over the edge with a scream that echoed off the canyon walls before cutting off abruptly. Jack crawled to the edge and looked down, seeing Morrison's broken body lying motionless on the rocks 50 feet below. The outlaw leader's silver spurs, his signature mark of vanity and cruelty, lay scattered and twisted among the stones, fitting symbols of a life that had been built on violence and ended in violence. Scout appeared beside Jack, breathing hard, but uninjured, his amber eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. The wild pack that had answered his call still lingered at the edge of the tree line, but they were beginning to fade back into the forest now that the immediate threat had passed. "It's over," Jack said, as much to himself as to Scout. "Morrison's dead. His gang is scattered and the people he would have hurt are safe." The badge on Jack's chest caught the last rays of sunlight, its tarnished surface somehow looking brighter than it had in years. Jack had worn it into battle as a symbol of the man he'd once been, but now it represented something more, the man he might still become if he could find the courage to believe in second chances. Scout pressed against Jack's side, offering the same wordless comfort that had sustained them both through their weeks together. The little wolf had proven himself not just as a companion, but as a partner worthy of the trust Jack had placed in him. As they gathered their gear and prepared to leave the trading post behind, Jack noticed something glinting among the rocks where Morrison had fallen. One of the outlaw's silver spurs had broken completely in half, its decorative engravings now meaningless scratches on twisted metal. Jack pocketed the broken spur as a reminder, not of vengeance achieved, but of justice served and the possibility of redemption for those willing to fight for it. Morrison's reign of terror was over, and the frontier was a safer place because two unlikely partners had chosen to stand together against the darkness. The wild pack had disappeared entirely now, melting back into the wilderness as silently as they'd arrived. But their presence lingered in the bond between Jack and Scout, a reminder that some loyalties transcended the boundaries between species and the artificial divisions between civilization and wild nature. Together, man and wolf walked away from the ruins of the trading post, leaving behind the ghosts of past failures and stepping forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. They had found each other in the wilderness, and they had been forged into something stronger through shared trials and mutual trust. The legend of Jack Sterling and his wolf companion was just beginning. Spring came early to the Wyoming Territory that year, bringing with it the kind of gentle warmth that made a man grateful to be alive to witness another season's turning. Jack Sterling sat by his campfire in the foothills outside Laramie, watching Scout, now considerably larger and more mature, investigate the scents around a cluster of wildflowers that had pushed through the last patches of winter snow. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the trading post, and word of their partnership had spread across the frontier with the speed that only truly remarkable stories could achieve. They'd become something of a legend in the territories, the former lawman and his wolf companion, who'd brought justice to places where law had never taken root. The territorial governor had officially reinstated Jack's authority as a deputy sheriff, complete with jurisdiction that covered the vast stretches of wilderness between established towns. It was work that suited both Jack and Scout perfectly, bringing order to the frontier while maintaining the freedom that both man and wolf needed to thrive. Scout had grown into his promise over the winter months, developing into a magnificent creature that stood somewhere between domestic dog and wild wolf. His coat had thickened into a rich grey, marked with silver highlights, and his amber eyes now held the wisdom of an animal who'd seen both the best and worst that humans could offer. More importantly, Scout had retained all the intelligence and loyalty that had first drawn Jack to him, while developing the confidence and capability that came with successful experience. He could track fugitives across seemingly impossible terrain, read human emotions with uncanny accuracy, and communicate with Jack through a complex system of signals that went far beyond simple commands. Jack reached into his saddlebags and pulled out his latest project, a leather collar he'd been crafting during their quiet evenings by the fire. The leather was dyed black and reinforced with brass studs, but its most distinctive feature was the small silver star mounted prominently on the front. It was fashioned from metal salvaged from Jack's own badge, shaped and polished until it gleamed like a mirror. "What do you think, partner?" Jack asked, holding up the finished collar for Scout's inspection. "Ready to make it official?" Scout approached with the careful dignity he'd developed over their months together, allowing Jack to fit the collar around his neck without fuss or resistance. The silver star caught the firelight, marking Scout as something unique in the frontier territories. An honorary deputy with authority that went beyond any law book, but was recognized by everyone who met them. The collar represented more than just a symbol of their partnership. It was a declaration that Scout belonged in both worlds, wild enough to run with the wolf packs that still howled from distant ridges, but civilized enough to walk the streets of frontier towns without causing panic among the citizens. Their reputation had brought them to the attention of important people throughout the territories. Ranchers requested their help with rustlers who seemed to disappear into thin air. Town sheriffs called on them when tracking skills beyond normal human capability were needed. Even the railroad companies had offered them work protecting survey crews in hostile territory. But perhaps their most satisfying cases were the ones that echoed their own beginning. Lost travelers found and guided to safety, injured animals nursed back to health, and the occasional reunion between humans and their animal companions who'd been separated by frontier hardships. Just last week, they'd helped reunite a little girl with her lost dog, tracking the animal for 3 days through rough country until they found it trapped in a canyon with a broken leg. The joy on the child's face when she was reunited with her pet had reminded Jack why he'd chosen to wear a badge in the first place: to protect those who couldn't protect themselves and to bring hope to situations that seemed hopeless. As Scout settled beside the fire wearing his new collar, Jack found himself reflecting on the circular nature of their story. They'd met when Scout was a desperate, starving pup begging for scraps from a lonely man's fire. Now they were respected throughout the territories, their partnership serving as proof that the bonds between different species could transcend the artificial boundaries that humans like to create. The silver star on Scout's collar gleamed in the firelight, but Jack noticed that his companion's attention was focused on something beyond their small circle of warmth and light. Following Scout's gaze, Jack saw a pair of golden eyes reflecting the flames from the edge of the darkness. Another wolf, young and alone, watching them with the same desperate hope that Scout had once shown. "Well," Jack said quietly, reaching for his supply of jerky, "I suppose some stories are meant to repeat themselves." Scout's tail wagged slowly as he watched Jack prepare to offer food to the newcomer. There was approval in the little wolf's posture, as if he understood that their partnership had grown large enough to include others who needed help finding their place between the wild and the civilized worlds. The young wolf approached cautiously, its movements speaking of recent hardship and current hunger. But there was also intelligence in its approach, and a quality of attention that reminded Jack powerfully of Scout's first night at his fire. "Before we jump back in," Jack said softly, the words coming from some deep memory of connection and possibility. "Tell us where you're from, and if this story touches you, know that tomorrow we've got something extra special waiting." Scout rumbled with quiet contentment as the new wolf accepted Jack's offering, his amber eyes bright with the satisfaction of a creature who'd learned the joy of sharing the kindness he'd once received. Their partnership had come full circle, but it was also evolving into something larger, a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly separate. The fire crackled peacefully as two wolves and one human settled in for the night, each secure in the knowledge that they belonged to something greater than themselves. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessing the continuation of a story that had begun with the simplest act of compassion and grown into a legend that would echo across the frontier for generations to come. Sometimes, the most unexpected friendships really are born from the simplest acts of kindness, and sometimes, when we're brave enough to extend that kindness despite our fears, we discover that the world is full of miracles waiting to happen around the next campfire, under the next starlit sky. The legend of Jack Sterling and Scout had become more than just their own story. It had become a reminder that compassion could change everything, one small act of courage at a time.